Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome once again to this exciting fireside chat on the topic, effectively managing data security and governance. Organizations today are sitting on huge mines of data, but they're struggling to make sense out of this. In the age of data bombardment, IT and business leaders must have proper data strategies in place. And in this fireside chat discussion with two leading leaders from UAE, we will discuss how organizations and leaders can go about building the right data strategy, ensuring the most effective and ethical usage of data. And with great pleasure, I would now like to invite and introduce our speakers for this session. First up, we have with us Badar Khan, Director of Digital Platforms, NEOM. Badar is a quality-focused senior software engineer with 6 years experience working for a Fortune 500 company in delivering software and hardware solutions addressing unique business needs. Experience in leading cross-functional teams in industrial automation, energy management, and healthcare. Badar is also an expert in embedded software, artificial intelligence, and computer-aided design. Our second speaker for this session is Manoj Ramachandran, Group CIO and Director of Technology, Babtain Group of Companies. Manoj is a technology evangelist and C-suite executive with 18 plus years of international experience in client management, business analytics, contracts management, and business growth. He has an exemplary track record in orchestrating complex ICT solutions and providing pivotal support in the delivery and management of projects. He is adept at strategically guiding organizations to meet business objectives and overcome challenges from concept to completion, and has proven competencies across management, analysis, consulting, architecture, and delivery disciplines. So thank you so much for joining us, Badar and Manoj. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for this opportunity to meet each other and learn from the masters. And thank you for this opportunity as well.
Yeah, so the idea exactly is to learn from the masters like you. I'm sure our audience will learn a lot from the insights that you would share in our conversation going forward. So without any further delay, let's start and learn more from you. So I'll come to you first, Manoj. How do you think, how can organizations build the right strategy, ensuring that the most effective and ethical use of data is there? It's very important in today's times. As we said, the data is huge. How do you make sense of it? How do you build the right strategy for it?
Yeah, the data governance is not an option, not an optional solution for the organization as of now. Yeah, the corporate world need to be grow within data, because we will always talk about that triangle, the data, information, the liberty. So this lot of things are changing. We will call it about digitalization and digital transformation. These words we are talking last 2-3 decades, this word will remain as it is, but the definition will change. Now the growth, the driving point of the organization is completely related to data. Data in the sense, that can be a structured data, that can be unstructured data. So data governance should be in place. The technical things cannot lead the data and make an analysis and decision based on that analysis, because even the machine learning algorithm can be biased. It's creating, the algorithm is created by the human beings. It will be a favorable for some point within the analysis over other things. It can be happen. So the technical part is 40%, the 60% is the governance. Even the governance, in the sense there should be a strategy. The objective should be properly defined, what actually the organization looking out of data. Without a clarity on objective of data, that the IT department or technical department cannot drive that, because this is nothing to do with the algorithm. Algorithm can be a biased again, what actually not looking for the organization. That is a very much important. That's a reason the governance, the data governance, the data strategy is too important for any organization to jump into a data lake. Then after that, we are moving into a data strategy, the next step. Without the governance, we cannot move that. Then we can decide that how we are processing the data, how we are storing the data, how we are analyzing. That is second step of analytics, the data management strategy. So yes, the governance is very much important, and the enterprise, senior management leadership should be clear about the vision, with data vision, not enterprise vision, not enterprise goal. Above all, there should be a data goal, data vision also should be clear.
I think those are some great points to begin with, actually, as you said, Manoj. While technical aspects will be there is data available and hordes of it there. But how do you build the right strategy by having governance at the forefront? It's very important to have the right governance, have the vision. How do you want to use the data? What is it that you want to use it for? That's going to be very important for organizations. So great points there. Badar, what about your thoughts on how can organizations look at building the right data strategy?
Yep, and that's a great point, Manoj. You hit on a lot of important aspects there around building the right vision, having the right technology, and I would say the purpose. So I would kind of go back a little bit when it comes to strategy and setting the vision. You should always start with the purpose. Why am I building the service, and why am I giving the service and providing the service? Today, when you talk about data and what data means to people, they're becoming more informed, right? So there's a lot of this issue, and governance is I would say a side effect or an effect of people asking questions of what are you doing with my data, right? And it starts with, we talk about and it's a very old problem in industries, right? So when you're doing gas turbines, things like that, there's not really hard touch points till you start to get into like, let's just say distribution or providing mobility, where it starts to hit users, right? And then users start to ask, well, is it going beyond just learning and optimizing my energy? Is it learning my behavior, right? So it starts to go into behavioral science and things like that. And so then it really becomes important to articulate the purpose of how your service is being provided and what purpose is it fulfilling for the users. And that's where a lot of the initiatives around user-centered thinking start to develop. Let's kind of put the user into the whole ecosystem. Started with Apple, putting at the heart of the product development that users, but now we need to apply that not to just products, but also on how we develop data strategies, right? In terms of what is the purpose of that data, and regulations are pushing us towards starting to think about that. But we as companies need to start to think about how do I develop, or what am I doing with this data, and how do I make it where users are able to easily understand this, right? And so those start to articulate two key pillars in my mind, right? Which is transparency, on letting users understand, here's what I'm doing with your data, here's how I'm using it with in my services, and here's the value it's providing to you, right? So once users start to understand, it's beyond just analytics and statistics where we think data finance, right? It's actually about you and how you're involved into that data ecosystem. And then it starts to create a very key component when we talk about data governance, is what we're trying to achieve is trust, right? That I want to develop that trust with you, that you understand with that transparency piece, how I'm using that data and how it's benefiting you, and then taking into account, here's how you get incentivized to participate within that whole ecosystem. So for me, data governance is a good start, but we need to take it a little bit more further. When it comes to strategy, you start the vision with a purpose, and then having key components around transparency and trust, right? Anchoring a lot of your use cases and services around trust.
Thanks, Badar. I think I totally agree with you there as well. I think purpose is very important. And then when you move on to putting transparency, trust, and user centricity, as you very rightly said, and how you're using the data, how are your users benefiting, what value can they get out of data? And if you put it out there and you put out your purpose out there, I think the right data strategy is built and it is in place. So great thoughts there. Thanks so much for sharing. Badar, I'll come to you again on what according to you are some of the best practices and success elements for managing data assets in today's time, especially?
Yep. So I think this then starts to build up on that strategy of purpose, trust, transparency. You start to say, well, I'm building these services. You start to ask the questions of, why am I building the services, right? When we talk about autonomous vehicles, I'm building this for a certain purpose, right? And there's a certain benefit that users get out of it. So when we're building products, we need to start to ask questions around not just how am I handling data, but what is this? Why am I collecting this data? How is it important? How does it feed into the service that I'm providing? And then how do I build those transparent? So your strategy and what you manifest from practice starts you start to ask questions more around autonomy, around the intention of why you're using that data. It's very important that as an organization, your intention is very clear to the users, because they're starting to becoming more aware about what you can do with your data, right? So if we start to think about large data breaches, large, financial breaches of how your financial assets, when they're compromised, can impact you directly, people start to ask. And regulations are now starting to put more pressure on services, on companies, on here's, you need to start thinking about that. So as a company, you should already start to build around those transparency and trust pieces about why am I building the service? What's the intention behind it? Why do I need to keep this data, right? So you start to limit your, what we call the surface area, your attack vector, with regard to, I'm keeping data and I'm able to separate core sensitive data, which we call PII data in the governance world, into from here's aggregated data that has generalized insights that you can't put down into a nation or a person or entity, right? So you start to separate those categories more naturally rather than, okay, well, I have all this information, I'm just collecting it and I have all these pipelines. How do I leverage for more financial gain? Rather, you're now developing more strategies around, and you open up, and as you build more services, so a lot of people then say, well, that's a double-edged sword because you're now limiting the amount of services you can create as a service provider, right? But actually, once you start to build that trust pieces, you can always enable those data points before enabling it, coordinating and having that users inside the service and say, well, we're providing this interesting service. Here's the data points that are required for that. Is this something you'll be interested in, right? So when you start to ask the why questions of what's the intention behind it, what's the service that I'm trying to build and deliver, and what's the benefit to the users, you start to have a better data governance strategy rather than just a strategy around protecting data and then ensuring you have the right guide rails, right? And just applying technology, because it's not a technology, 100% technology problem. Technology is an enabler and a push, but it's a problem about your users are the data points, right? You as users are the data points, providing those data points to create those insights.
Absolutely correct. I think, yes, the why part, if that is answered first, and why, what is it that you're going to do with the data, because your users are at the center of this entire, all the data assets that you've created. I think asking the why question and then building it on based on things like transparency and trust, as you very rightly said, will be the way forward. Manoj, any thoughts that you would like to add to, some best practices that you could share on managing best data assets?
Yeah, actually, as initially we discussed, and what Badar is told is correct. The governance should be in place. That is the benchmark. Which where the base, control base, which where we need to build entire our data journey. Because, for example, even if you don't have that objective, we have a lot of data, terabytes of data, and we don't need to waste time to that pre-processing the data, the managing data, bringing in an unwanted strategy to manage all this big data. Until unless if you don't have proper objective from the management or enterprise level objective, so we should have a clear objective in place. Then accordingly we will build the data strategy. Accordingly that, and we don't need to spend our time and cyber security investment, the analytical investment to process the unwanted data. Once that clear, as mentioned, that again, the process can be a manual process, maybe a very simple business intelligence process. It can be an AI and machine learning enabled process, because this is a different way of you handle your data. And even as initially told, even the algorithm can be biased. It's creating by again from the human being. So where once your objective is very much clear, then we can put it on all your effort into that. And plus, you need to get a feedback. Maybe while you're implementing your data strategy, you can think about that normal bring your own databases. One technology, maybe you need ETL. That data lake to handle your data. Maybe you have structured data, unstructured data, you have hybrid model of data. If you move more into a technical aspect, you have different, the form of the data. Then how much metadata you need to put into the data. That is one of the key factor, how the searchability will increase. So altogether, part of the data strategy, according to your, the enterprise data goal, objective, you're building everything into that. Finally, you are taking the feedback, right? What mean by doing all these things? Finally taking decision out of that in the organization, where you need a feedback from. Normally, we'll take a feedback from the decision makers. No, we need to take a feedback from even the user. Maybe you are using the user data, the customer experience data. That's the reason Badar is clearly told that the feedback need to be taken from the public as well. Public as well. Then only you can reduce, the bias characteristics of your analytics slowly as part of your growing into that. And you should have a proper governance, and you should be aligned with the control bodies, because without that, you cannot implement your cyber security, the data protection into that. That is very much important. It's not at all a perimeter security implementation. If you are talking about, the huge, the quantity of data, and you're making analysis out of that according to the management goal, you cannot think into how you will protect the data. That is a big question mark. You cannot use only the technology. We name it as a perimeter technology. The perimeter, the definition is changing now. The perimeter is not inside the organization. Perimeter is not inside the stakeholders. Perimeter can be a supplier. Perimeter going to be a cloud. So your cyber security, our data protection also changing accordingly into that. And always good to risk-based approach, not technology-based approach. To do a risk-based approach into a data governance, you should have proper governance in place, proper goal in place. Then you'll bring technology into that, the last stage. And you should be always aligned with the legal entities. You are handling data. So you're handling data into connected with the same like a GDPR or whatever, the different governance body need to be incorporate. That will be make easier the technology, the cyber security piece where we are building about your data into present into the public. Yeah, that is my thought regarding the same.
Yes, again, as you said, the technology comes, but before that, it is the people who are the data here actually. So how do you manage that? What feedback are you taking from them? How are you using that data? Keeping in mind even policies, practices, everything together. That's going to be very, very important. And that actually brings me to another question on, again, I'm coming back to data governance, and we started by talking about that, Manoj. Why is data governance becoming so important, especially in the times that we are living in today?
Again, we are talking about the data. Data is going to be everything, right? Maybe if you are normal, you are searching into any e-commerce website, where how you need to take a consent about the public. That is one of the big thing we need to handle. Maybe you can divide the data into like a private data, public data. Even if it is the user is giving the consent to use the data, maybe he have a concern that only used for this organization. We cannot use for external organization. So these things can be handled only by governance, the control body, only technology cannot handle that. Even if you're taking a cookies from the website, you're searching any e-commerce, you're taking that, how you can do that, the consent, the people are accepting the consent. Maybe if you're handling your data manually, assume that we don't have any technology in place, still we are handling data, right? We don't have artificial intelligence, we don't have machine learning, we don't have even e-commerce. Assume that some organization still they are running with that level. Still you should have a consent. Consent form need to be approved, agreed by the user. Where it's coming from. It's coming from governance. Technology cannot handle that. It's completely defined by governance. So you should always align with the global governance framework, which will be make easier to go ahead with your data plan, data strategy, data vision. Then you can incorporate your technology accordingly. That is the correct way to do that. Otherwise, you will face a lot of legal issues. And even if you have a public facing data, you're running an e-commerce, you're more, coordinating with the public. So these things need to be controlled. Technology cannot do that. So governance is the base, is the final framework. Then within that framework, you can build your strategy and your technology.
Yes, very, very interesting. Badar, your thoughts on that? Why is it so critical today?
So I think us as humans are very innovative, right? And we find very innovative solutions to kind of bypass, you might have a certain process as to how you're providing that service and what you're trying to glean out of it and what you're trying to promote. I think an example here would be probably, best suited where, and maybe not a consumer-centric example, because a lot of times those are very easy for us to relate to. Like, I'm using a mobility application, and there are certain data that they collect with regards to, what type of services do I use, prefer, where I'm going, locations, things like that. But it also applies to industry as equally, right? For example, in a power plant, you might be putting in, a process for what they call predictive maintenance activities, right? So we're going towards this predictive, being more prescriptive on, the health of our assets and kind of ensuring that we're doing these maintenance activities in a more timely manner. But there's a fear because once you put in this technology element into it, when a tech goes out and says, well, I need to do this particular job, what type of data is being collected upon me, not just the asset that I'm actually doing the maintenance on, right? So there's a little connection around, you used to have a paper clipboard paper, you went out, you did your routines on, let's just say, a gas turbine and took pictures and so forth. But now technology is coming in between. Not only are you able to just collect the data with regard to when he goes out to do the maintenance, right? So he's writing on this pad, just like a normal piece of paper, and filling out this form, but you're able to collect, where is he? Is he at the right location? Is he taking at the right time, right? So you can't kind of say, well, you did it an hour later, whereas you're supposed to do it an hour before. So there's that fear factor into these services that we're adding to enhance the assets, where we forget the human that is actually doing those activities, right? So more transparency in the piece of well, there are certain windows and how services occurred before. How do you bake that into the solution, the service that you're providing? How do you bring that transparency piece of, hey, we're actually collecting the information on where you are. It makes it easier for us to understand, are you actually performing the maintenance activity on the right component or not, right? Not as a direct measurement because it relates to my pay and also to my compensation, and am I doing the right job, right? So there's got to be more programs around how do you upscale users, people that are actually doing these activities, because it's not a robot today going out and doing these activities. It doesn't have a routine. There are certain things, there's coffee breaks, things like that. How do you bring those components into the service design? Because the service design is not a siloed activity anymore. There is a component where there's a human that goes in and does these tasks for you. So how do you build in that? And it goes back into, there's a governance piece, but you're collecting more information, and how do you make the users aware of that, right? So today in Android and Apple, you get a little green signal if you start to open up Zoom or an application that might be using your camera or mic, right? It's a more notification of bringing transparency on, hey, we're using this device or this particular thing to track this particular. So you understand what's the purpose. You're more comfortable using that technology. So we need to kind of bring that comfort level back. And it's not just a technology problem, but there's people actually facilitating that, right? So what that does then is to say, well, you're building these things that has a major effect on your data governance. You're not your stack about collecting your data is not only just a data point anymore. You also have an element of, here's a purpose I'm collecting this data for. And then Manoj mentioned consent, right? So consent is a byproduct of, oh, I'm collecting this data. I'm now after the fact going to ask you, oh, I need to use this data for to provide this service. Do I have your consent? It's like more of a formality rather than we're including you into the service that we're creating. And this is kind of what we think about when we're building products within our organization is, how do we build services that have key components around not a consent as an after effect, but privacy by design, having those risks baked into your product where the user can interrogate your service and say, well, what have you done with the data points that you're collecting, and how have you processed it? What are the data processors, not just the data collectors? What are the data processors behind that processing that data? Is it ad? Are you using it for? So you have more transparency and visibility into how that service is actually benefiting you, the value it creates, and how it's creating that value.
I think that's very interesting. I think that usual reaction of people to data is that they feel scared of it at the first go. They think they're being tracked. They think they're being monitored. And a lot of them, they're like, what, there's no privacy involved. Everything is out in the open. And I think bringing together technology and people, that is where it becomes very important with data, especially. You need people to understand that it is for their benefit. It's not intruding into their lives in that manner, but it's making work better for them, in fact. And that actually brings me to another question on cybersecurity and privacy management. Now, Badar, we are working in a hybrid environment mostly. I think it's become, it's the heightened risk of, data, cybersecurity is being talked about everywhere. So according to you, how can data governance help cybersecurity, privacy management, especially organizations and employees when their relationship is what we're talking about here in particular? How can that be tackled?
Again, it's not a siloed activity anymore, right? So because cybersecurity and those are all important pillars, and active cybersecurity is a measure that we need to keep on developing. There's not a, I would say, clear approach, right? So you need to kind of take your business and understand that and apply the right measures for what suits your particular business and how you're collecting that data, right? And also has an effect on the technology that you're choosing, right? So you can't apply it. So let's just say you have a machine learning algorithm, it's going to be very hard for you to kind of build services. So you need more advanced type of AI techniques to be able to counter those cyber attacks that can happen in algorithms, right? So this is even going beyond the data, where you're starting to consume those data into algorithms to create further insights. So those, all those elements are important, but you need to kind of back up and understand when you're building services around cybersecurity, privacy management, and the governance around that, is that the important piece is to notify the users about that a data breach has occurred and being timely about it, right? So that's kind of all the frameworks that we put in, and the risk assessments go around that, right? So, but it's a very postpartum type of thing, right? So there's a breach, that you do all these things to kind of understand that a breach has occurred and who do I notify? The question becomes, how do we build those mechanisms into how we're providing and consuming those data elements when we tap that data, right? So whenever there's a transaction occurring on that, and we need to kind of use the examples that we have from financial institutes, right? So we do a very good job of ensuring that no transaction is a duplicate transaction, right? So a lot of security measures around, financial institutes, learning from that industry and saying, well, they've automated that somehow, right? And there's really no, duplicate. I could go to one ATM and my friend can go to another ATM and still have a transaction, and there it's a seamless, balance adjustment there. How do we apply those mechanisms to more consumer or industrial type of settings where we think of data as transactions, right? So these are assets that we're transacting, and when we're doing those transactions, who's the one transacting? What's the purpose that transaction is occurring on? So you start to build more an active cybersecurity, active privacy, and consent type of system, rather than I'm just going to use that data provided as blindly to whoever is asking for it, to more of an active cyber secure type of system where all transactions are monitored. The transparency piece is that transaction is logged, and then using we're looking at ways to kind of say, well, we have newer technologies that can make data records more immutable, right? So the question becomes, who's storing that transaction, and is that record immutable, right? So now you can kind of leverage blockchains not for just crypto, but also for transactions on being able to say, well, there's a transaction that occurred that stays into a block, and anyone can interrogate that transaction, right? So you start to become more, as you log those transactions, more transparent on, here's a data is an asset. That data, when a transaction occurs on an asset, you log those transactions, just like as if you're selling your asset, doing money transactions, all those transactions are logged by an entity.
Interesting points. Thanks, Badar. Manoj, what are your thoughts on that, on cybersecurity and privacy management, and how can data governance play a role in it?
Yeah, that the threat landscape. While we are defining the threat landscape, we should be able to have a full clarity about what the data actually we are going to process according to the governance. That where the governance will help the cybersecurity wing to focus on where we need to protect the data, because we are talking about the data is not residing somewhere. We need to protect the data in transit, and as we discussed before, the perimeter is changing. That how you can implement a threat landscape to protect your data, because your perimeter is going to be a supplier, perimeter going to be a cloud. And if you, for example, very simple example, if you are implementing a content security, where you're implementing a DLP solution, data leakage protection. Still, you're implementing a DLP to try to protect the data within the organization. Doesn't make any sense. Now the data related to your, external, stakeholders, because you're expanding your perimeter. So where maybe you need to introduce new technology, which we maybe call it as a CASB. So CASB is adding, maybe 5-6 years before we are talking about content security. While we are talking about content security, we are talking about the DLP, we are talking about data classification. We are talking about WAF right now. In 2022, we are talking about the same content security, but we are adding more, the component into that. For example, we are talking about CASB. So your data is connected with, the lot of cloud solutions, the lot of traveling in a wide way, the data. If you're trying to protect the data in transit, your efforts, your threat landscape metrics will be more strong, So the same way the data is moving into maybe AI and machine learning, by adopting those technologies. So the cybersecurity also need to be travel in the same space. Your EDR, you cannot keep on-prem solution, and you are using your data processing by using your, AWS or Azure, any cloud solutions. So your EDR is still residing in on-premise, and you're using, the data processing in cloud solutions, and you cannot be able to protect your data. So you need to change your cybersecurity strategy accordingly with the data strategy. How you can get that? If you have proper data governance body is there, you can get the clarity on that. What is objective of the organization? What is the data we are going to process by using different, the methodology, where you can bring your, the cybersecurity landscape, the posters accordingly to align with that journey. So yes, 100%. Without data governance, cybersecurity cannot protect the data. So data governance is the base where cybersecurity to bring their posters and landscape to protect the data. Yes.
Perfect. And since we're talking so much about data governance here, my next question and my final question to both our speakers now is going to be about what are the kind of challenges that organizations can face, especially when you talk about data governance, and any inputs from your side and how those can be overcome. So Badar, would you like to answer that first? When we're talking data governance, we're talking a lot of data, we're talking purpose, we're talking transparency, we are talking, how do you manage cybersecurity in these times, all of that put together. What according to you are the highlights, the biggest challenges then?
Yep, 100%. I'm going to actually kind of hit on a couple of important points there, right? So it's beyond borders, right? So we're going hybrid, we're going, you have on-prem as well as cloud-based services that you're using, and you have data in transit as well as data where you're housing that data, whether it's on-premise or on a cloud provider like Azure, and they can have infrastructure type of breaches. So that's definitely a complex where you're relying on a complex issue where you're relying on services that are really outside of your boundary, where you're relying on infrastructure as a service, where you're relying on software as a service. So you need to create measures within how you're storing that data. What is the protocols you're going to kind of put in place with regards to access to that data and so forth. And that's kind of where you're talking about data storage and data access issues. Then it goes into more of, how the service is being provided and mechanisms toward that. So explainability of here's how I'm accessing that data, immutability of those data transactions when we talk about data as assets and transactions, because it goes into the fundamental question of who's owning those data assets, right? So whose assets are they? So certain agencies around, the purpose and is the right purpose, explainability of those purposes. And I think the last thought I leave off is, as we've made, service integrations, right? So when we talk about service integrations and portability and so forth, why not start to think about open APIs for data governance and consent and privacy, right? To say, well, why can't anyone interrogate how you're using my assets? Do you have the right measures with regards to interrogating transactions? Just the way I can understand my financial history, pull out my records and so forth, data should be handled the same way, right? So I should, as a user or as an entity, when I'm going to using your infrastructure or using your software as a service, be able to interrogate how you're moving that, because everybody's moving data, right? So when you store into infrastructure, there is mechanisms that they put into making sure that data is available. You can't get that 99% uptime of data if they don't have these contingencies. How do they move that data, having more transparency into that? And that requires more open standard APIs to say, well, I can now take that, and now you've created a chain rather than just having at your service level all the way down into your stack as well as your infrastructure level in regards to saying, here's how we're moving data, here's where it's staying. And then you start to also open up sovereignty issues, right? Because we're not able to address sovereignty issues because we don't understand how and what mechanisms you're providing as an infrastructure provider or as a software as a service provider or as a service provider on where you're storing my data and how you're giving me the ability to access that information, right? Because I can access that information whether I'm in India, Pakistan, or in the US or in Europe, I can with my mobile phone, right? But that accessibility requires some network and interconnection, right? So more visibility into that. And so we're looking at a way to kind of say, well, how do you open standard that, where there's a standard mechanism, just the way you have for sharing your open APIs, sharing common mechanisms for industrial type of applications or financial records to have, and your health records, right? So you can access your health records as a user, have that for how your data is actually handled as well.
I think that's going to be a very important part. If people can know how their data is being handled and managed, what use is it being put to, if that transparency, as you said, if it's open APIs, that will make a huge difference to how data governance works in organizations. Manoj, what about your thoughts, your final thoughts on some challenges and how can those be overcome when we talk of data governance?
Yeah, while we are talking about the challenges of the data governance, as we mentioned, that while we are, once your data governance is defined, when you're really going to the ground level and implementing the governance strategy into your operations, while you're talking about, your data architecture, it's not only about your data, it's about your, the variety of your data resources, where you are collecting your structured and unstructured data. And once you got the data, you are processing the data. And while we are using different way of processing, the pre-processing that you want to do a dimensionality reduction, you want to remove, that layers, and by using artificial intelligence, machine learning, maybe you are using conventional databases. So the data is handling into that way. So this enterprise architecture, all together, once you defined your governance, your strategy, then EA in coming into the place. So still most of the organizations thinking about the still we are talking about TOGAF 9.2 or SAGMAN. We are still depend with those framework. Finally, your entire COE is built based on this enterprise architecture, where data is coming into the first place as of now. So now your enterprise architecture plan is not capable to handle this defined. Finally, we defined the data strategy and governance. That's going to be a big issue. That is one of the biggest challenge. So this data governance is the integral responsibility of enterprise architect. The easy way to overcome that challenge: upgrade your EA, upgrade your enterprise architecture plan, involve, integrate that governance part. To do that, yes, we need to do a portfolio management. While you are doing the portfolio management to identify your silo system, you are doing the portfolio management to identify your legacy system. But you, as part of our enterprise architecture, we are not doing the portfolio management to identify our silo data. Again, we are putting the effort, tries, more time to getting the same outcome. We are putting a lot of efforts, a lot of time for the same job, maybe between multiple projects and everything. Yeah. So yes, resources are one of the challenges. That is enterprise sugar. Why you are bringing the higher level of data governance part of your enterprise architecture, you should have a resource to who can handle, the integrated enterprise architecture level, more than a conventional way of EA. So that is one of the challenge. And the clarity, the leadership should understand, that what mean by the data. That data is how much data, how much liberty is going to provide to the organization in regards to scalability, expansion, whatever, that need to be understood. The leadership is going to be a major challenge. The resource is going to be a challenge. A lot of silo data is going to be a challenge. So there is a solution, only one solution: upgrade your enterprise architecture plan. That will be resolved.
Thanks, Manoj. Again, great suggestions by you. Badar and Manoj, I think we've come to the end of the conversation, but before we wrap up, I just want you to give one piece of advice maybe to technology leaders, to leaders, to that one thing that will help them build the right data strategy. Just one piece of advice. Badar, I'll come to you first, and then I'll come to you, Manoj.
So I think it starts with people, right? So any organization you're building, you can have the best strategy, but if you don't have people that understand that strategy to kind of and take ownership of it, it starts with them, right? So build an organization that is centered around people, and then building the right frameworks, right? So enablement pieces.
Yes.
Once you have that in place, then you kind of have to start to look at what is the best pieces that I need to kind of put in when it comes to service transparency, trust, and that openness with regards to how am I providing that data to you, and what's the value of it, and incentivizing all stakeholders within that whole thing, right? So think about those elements. It goes into that user-centricness, but start with the folks that you bring on board.
Lovely, lovely. That's a great thought. Yes, the theme of our conference is high tech, high touch workplaces. It's all about actually people at the core of all the change that we're talking about. So even if it when talk about data and data governance, if you have to first think of bringing the right people on board, and very rightly said that having trust and transparency in how the data is being used. So thanks, Badar. Thank you so much, Manoj. Your final thoughts. Your one piece of advice.
Yep, same like Badar. I have the same thought process. Educate the people. That what mean by data, what mean by the liberty is giving by the data. It's not only the senior management. You need to educate. Train the people 360-degree, because data protection is not a responsibility of a specific department. It's the data is traveling with all the employees. So the education and awareness about the cyber security, the awareness about how important you are handling data related to information of someone else, that awareness need to be spread across the group. We need to more educate the people. Same time, yes, we need to onboard a high level of skill which can spread a new way of handling data with their existing colleague as well. So that's all mean by the high tech HR next tech HR summit. You are trying to build the correct awareness to this community. It's great. Thank you for very much. As well as an IT leader is a great help. The people is very much important. More than process, more than technology. Still in 2022, people is very much important.
Thank you so much, Manoj, and thank you so much, Badar. Those were some great insights and takeaways for our audience. Indeed, data governance is going to be very important for organizations going forward. And before that, it is about having the right people in place, having the right purpose, the right vision for how you're going to use that data, and then having transparency and trust in people, building that in people so that they know that their data is adding value to them and is not something to fear. So on that note, that was all the time we had for this session. Thank you everyone for joining us. Do stay with us for many more such exciting sessions, and also participate in our contests to win some exciting prizes. Thank you once again.